Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my channel? Thank you so much. A man is not killed. He is dismantled. The crowd had gathered before dawn, some traveling for hours in the mud-soaked dark. Children were lifted on his shoulders, vendors shouting over the swell of excitement, not unlike a festival. But what they were here to witness was no celebration. It was punishment. The kind of punishment that demanded not silence, but applause. At the center of it all, a man stood chained, not yet broken, but close. His name has long since faded into obscurity, a political pawn in a treason case lost to the footnotes of medieval annals. But what he endured would echo through history as perhaps the most barbaric spectacle of state violence ever devised. He had been hanged, but not until dead. That would have been too kind. Instead, he dangled, half-strangled, eyes bulging, limbs flailing, the body's desperate instinct to live overriding all dignity. Gasps from the front rows, laughter from others. Somewhere, a child cried, unsure why the adults had gone so quiet. Then came the knife. Before his eyes, the executioner raised a small, curved blade. A cheer rose from the crowd as the man's genitals were sliced off, not cleanly, but with the deliberate cruelty of a butcher, not a surgeon. Blood sprayed. The man's scream, a garbled, gurgling wail, reached the ears of spectators in the back. He was then cut open, slit from chest to groin, his entrails slowly pulled from his abdomen and burned in front of him. Smoke rising, mixing with the scent of hot iron, wet cloth, and feces. The pain did not kill him. Not yet. That was intentional. When his life finally slipped, it did so not with piece, but piece by piece. His limbs were chopped off, not ceremonially but mechanically, as if the man himself were an object to be unassembled. His head was severed, boiled, and mounted on a spike above the city gates. His arms and legs sent to distant counties, nailed to public walls. This wasn't a punishment. This was a message carved in blood, designed to linger in memory long after the man's name was gone. It was the punishment reserved for traitors, and it came with a name so sanitized by time that its true horror is often forgotten. Hung, drawn, and quartered. It sounds procedural, almost archaic, but beneath those three words lies a ritual of sadism so extreme it defies comprehension. A method of execution not intended to kill swiftly, but to annihilate completely the body, the soul, and most importantly, the idea the condemned stood for. What kind of society invents a punishment like this? What does it say about power and about us that such horror was once a public spectacle and sometimes a celebration? Hung, drawn, and quartered. Three words polite, abstract, and deceptively dull. But behind them lies a reality so grotesque, so systemically engineered for maximum pain and humiliation that even modern descriptions struggle to do it justice. This wasn't just execution, it was performance, a calculated ritual, each stage designed to deconstruct a human being. In front of an audience, physically, mentally, symbolically, it was punishment. As propaganda, terror as justice. Let's break it down, not for morbid fascination, but to understand how medieval power worked and what it feared most. The condemned was first paraded through the streets, often tied backward on a wooden hurdle or dragged behind a horse. The intention wasn't just discomfort, it was degradation. The individual was shown to the people not as a person, but as an object, a thing being taken to slaughter. Once at the gallows, the man, and it was almost always a man, was hanged by the neck, but crucially, not to death. This was no swift drop and broken neck. That was reserved for nobility. Common traders were suspended just long enough to suffer, to flail, to gasp, to soil themselves as oxygen fled the brain. The body's primal instinct to live clashed with the certainty that it would soon be taken apart. Sometimes the rope was too long, and the feet touched the ground, a partial suspension. Other times, the executioner would lift and drop the condemned repeatedly, simulating suffocation again and again. It wasn't a death sentence, it was the opening act. The word drawn is often misunderstood. In some interpretations, it refers to the dragging of the prisoner to the site, but in most contexts, especially from the 13th century onward, drawn referred to disembowelment, the literal removal of the internal organs while the prisoner was still alive. It is here that the punishment shifts from execution to anatomical horror. Once cut down from the gallows, semi-conscious, breathless, vomit-stained, the man was stripped, pinned down, and sliced open. First, the genitals were removed, not just to cause pain, but as a symbolic destruction of masculinity, lineage, and honor. These were sometimes burned immediately in a brazier, their smoke rising beside the condemned's face. Then came the belly. A long incision down the torso opened the abdomen, allowing the executioner to remove the intestines foot by foot, carefully and publicly. Still conscious, the condemned would feel the slimy cords of his own insides slither out, the heat from the fire where they were burned, and the cheers of a crowd conditioned to see justice in agony. The heart, often the final organ to be pulled, was sometimes removed while still beating. Chroniclers note cases where the executioner would hold it aloft before crushing it or tossing it into the fire. Pain was only part of the equation. This was about unmaking a man in front of nation. Once the condemned was dead, or close enough, the body was beheaded, but this too was ritualistic. The severed head was boiled, sometimes tarred, then mounted on a spike and placed atop a gate, bridge, or city wall. Tower Bridge in London, Micklegate Bar in York. These became grotesque message boards of royal power. But it didn't end there. The body was then quartered, cut into 4 parts, usually at the joints. Each limb was boiled or salted to prevent decay and sent to different parts of the kingdom, especially towns associated with the condemned supporters or hometown. Imagine it. A severed leg nailed to a church door, an arm dangling from a city gate, a torso discarded into a pit. This was execution as fragmentation, the literal disassembly of a human being across geography to serve as an eternal, inescapable warning. There would be no grave, no shrine, no martyrdom, just pieces. The entire process, from partial hanging to the public burning of intestines to the scattering of limbs, wasn't about death. It was about obliteration. To be hung, drawn, and quartered was to be made an example, reduced to a cautionary tale in blood and ash. It was the medieval state saying, "This is what happens when you defy us. You are not merely killed, you are deleted." Every detail was symbolic. Hanging without death mocked the possibility of a quick escape. Castration killed lineage and honor. Dismemberment desecrated the sacred body. Quartering erased wholeness. Public display denied even anonymity in death, and every element was justified under the law, specifically for the crime of high treason, a term that could mean everything and nothing. Criticizing the king, supporting the wrong heir, worshiping the wrong god, being on the wrong side of history. The punishment said more about those who ordered it than those who suffered it. This was violence with intention, horror refined into law, a punishment designed not just to end a life, but to burn it into the collective memory of a frightened public. To kill a man is easy. To make a kingdom fear him after death, that takes art. The act of hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't just a grotesque invention of cruelty. It was a crafted instrument of state control, a punishment born not of chaos, but of order. Deliberate, legal, ritualized, its emergence in medieval Europe, particularly in England during the 13th century, marked a turning point in how monarchs wielded violence, not merely as retribution, but as a psychological tool. So why did this punishment arise when it did? Why was it reserved for treason and not for murder, rape, or theft? Because treason was not just a crime, it was an existential threat. Under medieval law, particularly Anglo-Norman and later Tudor law, treason was not defined by the damage done, but by who was offended, and that was always the monarch. You could kill your neighbor and still be buried in consecrated ground. You could blaspheme, even assault someone in church, and still get off with a penance. But to question the king's right to rule, or worse, support a rival, meant you were attacking the very structure of reality as it had been divinely ordained. A king was not simply a ruler. He was God's appointed presence on earth. To betray him wasn't just civil rebellion. It was cosmic blasphemy, and such a crime could not be punished in private. It had to be public, ritualistic, and terrifying. The earliest recorded use of hanging, drawing, and quartering. England was in 1283 with the execution of Dafydd ap Griffith, the last independent Prince of Wales, captured by Edward I after a failed uprising. Dafydd was dragged to Shrewsbury, hanged, eviscerated, beheaded, and quartered. But this was no military punishment. It was a statement. The codification of this punishment came with the Treason Act of 1352 under Edward III. This law laid out in gruesome specificity that the punishment for high treason would be that the traitor be drawn to the gallows and hanged by the neck, and being alive, cut down, and his entrails taken out and burned while he yet liveth, and his head cut off and his body quartered. It reads like a recipe, but it wasn't just legal language. It was an instructional script, a government-mandated performance. This law, written in blood and terror, stayed in effect for over 500 years, and it was designed not just to punish the traitor, but to prevent the formation of martyrs. A clean death, especially one carried out with dignity, could elevate a man's memory, but mutilation, anonymity, and public ridicule, that was a political eraser. You might expect religious authorities to denounce such barbarism, but they didn't. Why? Because the punishment was never secular. Monarchs ruled with divine right, which meant that to oppose the king was to oppose God. The church and crown shared interests and enemies. Treason trials were carefully staged. Accusations, vague evidence, hidden confessions extracted, executions timed for maximum attendance, often delayed until market days to ensure large crowds. Over time, the punishment evolved into something more than deterrence. It became theater. The scaffolds were built in prominent squares. The executioners became minor celebrities. Children were brought to witness the spectacle. It was mandatory mourning with snacks. And what's most chilling? People got used to it. In town squares across England, crowds cheered, jesters mocked the condemned, vendors sold meat pies beside the scaffold. Life and death blended together. Horror became ordinary because that was the point. The state wanted to normalize cruelty to build a population so used to obedience through fear that rebellion became unthinkable. The architecture of this punishment was not built from sadism alone. It was built on strategic psychology. Centuries before the term existed, public execution was not meant to kill one person. It was meant to control millions. To kill the traitor's body, to erase his name, to scatter his memory, to silence any who might follow. Every element had symbolic weight. Dragging through the streets equals humiliation and exposure. Hanging but not dying equals suspended judgment. Castration and disembowelment equals loss of lineage, self, and sanctity. Beheading equals the destruction of thought and speech. Quartering equals the fragmentation of power and unity. And if that wasn't enough, the remains were often displayed across distant counties, broadcasting the punishment, like state-sanctioned propaganda. Ironically, some of the most brutal executions produced the most enduring legends. William Wallace, executed in 1305 for rebelling against English rule, was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His limbs were scattered, but centuries later, he became a symbol of Scottish resistance. Guy Fawkes, captured during the failed gunpowder plot in 1605, was subjected to torture so brutal he could barely sign his own name. His execution, meant to crush Catholic rebellion, instead birthed Bonfire Night, where children still chant his name. The punishment may have silenced dissent in the short term, but it could not control memory. In some cases, it amplified it. This is the paradox of barbaric justice. The more brutally it tries to erase, the more power it gives to the idea it seeks to destroy. In trying to make examples, the state often made legends, and no legend burned more brightly or suffered more excruciatingly than the man we turn to next, William Wallace. You can take our lives, but you'll never take our freedom. That line, immortalized in Hollywood myth, has echoed for decades in pop culture. But the truth behind William Wallace's death is far more disturbing than anything cinema has ever dared to depict. Because freedom wasn't taken from Wallace with a sword or a prison cell. It was carved out of him inch by inch, organ by organ, in one of the most gruesome public executions ever recorded. This wasn't just about punishing rebellion. It was about erasing the man behind the rebellion. And for that, the Crown turned to its most effective tool, public obliteration. To the Scottish people, William Wallace was a leader, a man who had defied English occupation, led armies against King Edward I, and refused to bend the knee to the English crown. However, Wallace wasn't a general. He was a traitor, captured in 1305 through betrayal, some say by a fellow Scot. Wallace was brought to London not as a prisoner of war, but as a criminal against the state. And criminals of that sort were not imprisoned. They were made an example. No trial by peers, no formal defense. The charges were predetermined, and the sentence was older than the accused, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for high treason. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was stripped naked, tied to a wooden hurdle, and dragged through the streets of London by horses. This slow procession, nearly 2 miles long, was designed for maximum public exposure. People pelted him with filth. Children were lifted to see the man who had dared defy the king. By the time he reached Smithfield, the site of his execution, Wallace's body was bruised, filthy, and baking in the late summer heat. But the real punishment had not even begun. Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, suspended by the neck until unconscious, but cut down before life had fully left him. Spectators reportedly shouted for the rope to be loosened early, wanting more from the show. Then the real horror began. His genitals were sliced off and tossed into a fire in front of him. His abdomen was then cut open and his intestines were pulled out slowly, methodically burned while he still breathed. Chroniclers from the time don't agree on whether he was fully conscious for all of it, but given the goal was to maximize suffering, it's likely that executioners paced the agony, allowing time for the crowd to absorb each moment. His heart was the last organ removed, symbolic of the state's final claim over the man's will. It was burned, then finally, mercifully, Wallace's head was severed. But even in death, his body was not allowed dignity. Wallace's head was dipped in tar and mounted on a spike at the top of London Bridge, one of the most visible landmarks in the city. It stayed there for months, a silent sentinel over the Thames, warning travelers and traders alike. This is what happens when you dream of freedom. But the horror didn't end at the head. His body was quartered, and the pieces were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, key Scottish cities meant to suppress rising nationalist sentiment. Each city received its gruesome parcel, an arm here, a leg there. The limbs were nailed to gates and towers, and the message was clear. The rebellion had a body, and it had been taken apart. Wallace's execution wasn't about killing one man. It was about broadcasting fear to an entire nation. Dragging through the streets equals humiliation. Castration equals destruction of masculine identity. Evisceration equals desecration of a sacred body. Quartering equals erasure of unity. Display equals denial of martyrdom. The goal was psychological terrorism, to make future rebellion unthinkable, to sever not just limbs but legacy. But here's the irony. The punishment failed. Rather than erase Wallace, his execution elevated him in Scotland. Tales of his bravery multiplied. Poets and balladers resurrected his legend. His death, meant to extinguish, instead became a flame. The exact location of his quarters may be lost, his bones scattered, but the idea he stood for, resistance, autonomy, pride, became more powerful because of how brutally the state tried to kill it. Even in the modern era, Wallace remains a folk hero. His story, distorted or not, stands as proof that sometimes cruelty only magnifies memory. The same punishment used on Wallace would be repeated again and again across centuries, most famously and grotesquely on another man who defied the English state, Hugh Despenser. And if you thought Wallace's end was horrific, Despenser's fate takes the brutality to an entirely new level. Some executions are about justice. Some are about spectacle. But the execution of Hugh Despenser was about vengeance. Not just from the people, not just from the king, but from a nation, a queen, and a political system that had waited years to return the cruelty they believed he embodied. And what they delivered wasn't merely a death. It was a ceremony of mutilation choreographed to strip away not only his life, but his sexuality. To understand why Hugh Despenser the Younger was subjected to one of the most horrifying executions in recorded European history, you must understand the venomous hatred he inspired. A favorite and likely the lover of King Edward II, Despenser was not just a royal advisor, but a parasitic presence at court. Ruthless, greedy, and openly contemptuous of the nobility, he amassed lands and power at an alarming rate, largely by blackmail, manipulation, and outright theft. More dangerously, he alienated Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, and much of the English baronage. His influence over the king was seen as both sexual and sinister, a toxic blend in a deeply patriarchal, heteronormative medieval society. By 1326, when Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer invaded England to depose Edward II, Despenser was public enemy number one. Despenser fled with Edward, but was captured near Lantris in Wales. His trial was a farce, a predetermined list of accusations read aloud with no defense allowed. The charges were both political and personal: stealing royal funds, torturing nobles, influencing the king's mind and body, and committing sodomy, not just with the king, but with other young men. This last accusation is crucial. It weaponized his sexuality, real or rumored, into a legal justification for maximum public degradation. He was dragged naked through the streets on a hurdle, a standard practice, but with a twist. He was dressed in his coat of arms turned upside down, a symbolic gesture to reverse the power he had once held. Crowds threw filth, children shouted obscenities they barely understood. Chroniclers described the atmosphere not as solemn but gleeful, almost erotic in its rage. Once at the scaffold, the execution deviated from the standard hung, drawn, and quartered format. Despenser's punishment was deliberately extended, each act choreographed for symbolism and pain. He was first hanged, but slowly lifted by rope over and over without allowing death. Witnesses recorded that his body jerked violently as his eyes bulged and his tongue protruded. Then, while still alive, he was tied to a ladder, his legs and arms spread in a crucifixion-like posture, fully exposed. Genital mutilation came next. Despenser's penis and testicles were cut off and thrown into a fire in front of him, a theatrical act meant to punish his alleged sodomy and eliminate any symbol of virility. His abdomen was sliced open, and the executioner slowly pulled out his intestines inch by inch. Chroniclers noted that the fire crackled as Despenser watched his own entrails burn until he passed out, or perhaps even beyond. Then came beheading, not with one clean stroke, but several hacking blows. Finally, his body was quartered, the limbs scattered to 4 regions of the kingdom, and his head displayed on London Bridge, the fate of traitors. Despenser's execution wasn't about justice. It was about revenge, politics, and public humiliation on a theatrical scale. Isabella and Mortimer wanted to punish Edward II without killing him directly. They aimed to crush the memory of Despenser and warn other royal favorites that intimacy with a monarch could cost them their lives. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Despenser's death reveals the deep fusion of sex and punishment in medieval political culture. His alleged homosexual acts were used as justification for castration and public genital mutilation, framing the execution as a moral purification, not just a political one. Contemporary reports suggest that even in a society accustomed to death, many found Despenser's execution shocking in its extremity. Chroniclers, normally unflinching, noted the erotic tension and sexualized sadism with which the execution was carried out. It was a performance designed not just to eliminate a threat, but to make a spectacle of masculinity itself. Despenser wasn't just punished. He was emasculated, desecrated, burned, and scattered, all while being cheered, mocked, and ultimately forgotten, or so they hoped. But even here, obliteration failed. His story lives on, not because people admired him, but because the depth of his execution's cruelty continues to fascinate. If Wallace's death represented nationalist martyrdom, Despenser's represented the weaponization of public hatred and sexual panic. Centuries later, the state would use the same mechanics, spectacle, mutilation, and control of narrative to destroy another infamous figure, Guy Fawkes. Remember the 5th of November. The rhyme is still sung, the fireworks still light the sky, and the effigies still burn. But behind the cheerful modern pageantry of Guy Fawkes lies a public execution so brutal, so calculated, that it became a textbook case of how to weaponize death into myth, not in favor of the condemned, but in favor of the state. Because Guy Fawkes wasn't just executed, he was theatrically destroyed, with the full machinery of England's monarchy, church, and media working in sync to turn his body into a symbol of obedience. In 1605, a group of English Catholics conspired to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, killing King James I, his family, and the nobility in one blast. Their goal was to end Protestant rule and restore a Catholic monarchy. The gunpowder plot failed. The gunpowder was discovered, and among those arrested was a man with gunpowder residue on his clothes and a fake name on his lips, Guy Fawkes. To the English state, Fawkes was not just a criminal. He was a symbol of religious extremism, foreign influence, and an existential threat. That meant his punishment had to do more than kill him. It had to reassert the king's divine power, punish Catholic rebellion, and scare the population back into submission. Fawkes was imprisoned in the Tower of London and subjected to torture, which under English law required royal permission. King James granted it eagerly, writing, "The gentler tortures are to be first used, then proceed to the worst." For days, Fawkes racked his joints, dislocated limbs stretched, body broken. The result, a confession scrolled in a barely legible hand, his name barely written, a document still preserved to this day. By the time he was sentenced to die, he could barely walk, but that wasn't seen as a failure. It was a prelude. Fawkes and his surviving co-conspirators were led from the tower in carts, jeered by crowds, pelted with filth. They were hanged one by one, but not to death. Each was cut down while still alive, genitals severed, bowels extracted and burned, hearts torn out before decapitation and quartering. Fawkes, last in line, had been so physically destroyed by torture that he could barely ascend the ladder to the noose. And here, depending on the source, a strange mercy or final resistance occurred. He jumped, either by accident or design. Fawkes leapt from the scaffold with enough force that his neck snapped instantly. He died before the dismemberment could begin. The crowd was robbed of their final entertainment, but the symbolism endured. The government wasted no time. Pamphlets, sermons, and paintings flooded England. The execution was described not just in physical terms, but in theological, moral, and patriotic tones. Fawkes's broken body became a symbol of Catholic treachery, foreign corruption, and divine justice. Bonfires were ordered to be lit annually by royal decree to commemorate the king's deliverance. This became Bonfire Night or Guy Fawkes Night, and so his destruction was complete, not just in flesh but in memory. And yet, centuries later, Guy Fawkes's name is still remembered, not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of resistance. Modern culture, from the V for Vendetta mask to anti-authoritarian protests, has reclaimed the image of Fawkes, stripping it of the monarchy's message and turning it into something the state never intended: rebellion reborn. But in 1606, that outcome was unthinkable to the government. The execution of Guy Fawkes was a masterclass in fear. His broken body became a billboard of warning, stretched out in quarters across the land. His death wasn't about ending a man. It was about ending an idea. 3 case studies, 3 brutal executions, 3 bodies destroyed, scattered, and rewritten by the state. But these were not anomalies. They were part of a larger system, one built on a terrifying principle. The body is a canvas, power is the artist, and pain is the medium. In the next segment, we'll examine how the execution itself became an entertainment ritual and why medieval Europe didn't just tolerate this barbarity, it applauded it.